Michael Copeland.
Thank you very much, Mr. Principal Deputy Speaker. Could I first of all apologise to you, the Minister, and indeed Mr Mickey Brady for missing their opening remarks. I was unavoidably absent from the Chamber this morning due to constituency business which had been previously notified to the Speaker. I will, sir, with your permission, talk on the general principles of the bill shortly. However, I would like to make a few comments in regard to the timings of this debate. As I rise to speak today, I look back with a sense of frustration at recent events, not only since last Thursday evening, but the progress, or not, as the case may be, that this legislation has taken since the beginning of the year. It is, in my view, an indictment of the two main partners within the Executive, having dangerously delayed this bill for so long, that now there is not only a genuine danger of it not receiving royal assent in time, but also whether it will pass the stages it needs to in this House. This piece of legislation, the biggest reform of our social security system in generations, has, as has been said, the potential to encourage thousands of our people to move from welfare dependency into employment, to make the failing system fairer, and to save billions of taxpayers' pounds. But it also has the potential, if implemented wrongly, to destroy lives, to take away support from people who cannot afford to lose anything else, and to leave behind many of the most vulnerable in society who this Assembly has a moral obligation to protect. Whilst I will talk on the reasoned amendment and the bill together, I would like to make a number of preliminary remarks at this stage. I look across the Chamber at the Sinn Féin benches, and I see, obviously, an Assembly group not at ease with this bill. I have no doubt that they have major concerns, and I look at their amendments and honestly can agree with many, if not all, of their points. But I also see a party in danger of neglecting their legislative and governance responsibilities. Their proposal to delay would, to me, be understandable if this was the month of April or May, but it's not. It's October. Thanks to their track record on this issue, both in the Executive and behind closed doors, they must at least share some of the blame, as well as their partner, at the farce of only managing to bring this bill to this House at such a late stage. So I would ask them one simple question. Why have you, as lead partners in the Executive, left it so late? This bill is so important to so many people. We quite simply cannot afford to get it wrong. Every Executive meeting that they and their colleagues refused to get this onto the agenda meant in reality less and less time for this House to put right the obvious failings which will flow from this flawed legislation. And it's the same for the regulations. Indeed, they make that very point at the beginning about flexibility and consideration of Northern Ireland is crucial to the foundation of the entire bill. This bill, these words, which we are meant to be having a so-called high-level discussion on today, were not drafted here in Northern Ireland. They do not reflect Northern Ireland. And they show absolutely no compassion for Northern Ireland. Where, Minister, are the differences between this bill today and the Welfare Reform Act, which received royal assent in March? Show us the flexibility which you yourself have said Northern Ireland should exploit. If this flexibility lies within the regulations, tell us exactly which ones they are and what you intend to do about it. Your officials have had 7 months. I would ask you, Minister, to explain how they used them. Of course, you could forgive us for knowing why Sinn Féin may have tabled this so-called reasoned amendment. The dogs in the street have a view. They can see it. They believe it's a game of political brinksmanship, which it may or may not be. They think that by waiting to this stage they can send out hard-hitting statements and their base will suddenly realise how anti-welfare reform that they have been the whole time. But I doubt if the electorate in Northern Ireland like being taken for fools. We have, thank God, put behind us what was once called an acceptable level of violence. Now we are in danger of developing an acceptable level of political brinksmanship. Both are wrong. Both create casualties, and both do not represent good governance. On that point, no matter what Sinn Féin stand up and say, there are some questions that will require further answers. And Mr. Maskey, cleverly, has predicted one of these questions and gone some way towards addressing it. My first is quite simple. Why now? I apologise for repeating myself on this point, but it needs to be said. This bill has been trapped in the corridors of Stormont Castle for months. Surely they should have used this time to put right what they considered to be the main failings. Would the delay now be a sign that they can complain about the passage of the bill as much as they like, but maybe resigned to seeing what may be its inevitable passage? Or maybe the Sinn Féin leadership have suddenly realised that while they quite happily sit in the Northern Ireland Executive, which I welcome, overseeing what could be perceived as slashed services and deprived departments such as health from adequate funding, they sit in Dáil Éireann in the city of Dublin and effectively accuse that government of treachery for doing something which is very similar to what has had to be done here. My second question is, for how long do they want to delay this bill? An hour? A week? A month? A fortnight? It can't be a month, as we know, because there simply isn't time. And my final question to Sinn Féin, and the one that they may find most difficult to answer, is if they are so diametrically opposed to the bill in its current form, why was it not blocked in the Executive before it got here? On that latter point, even though it would appear, sir, I will follow your example. on that latter point, even though it would appear that DSD got up to even less work over the summer than everyone was expecting, Sinn Féin and the SDLP must realise that they can effectively kill off this bill and all of the little original work which has gone into it. Nevertheless, my criticisms of Sinn Féin's actions on this are all the more frustrating for me, given the fact that the points they raise in their reasoned amendment strike a chord. The reasoned amendment rightfully talks about the need of consideration of Northern Ireland's special circumstances. Neither I nor the Ulster Unionist Party wants to be accused of being particularly parochial on the reform of welfare across the United Kingdom. As I have said, we recognise the need for change. But we must remember that first and foremost we are elected here in Northern Ireland to protect the citizens of Northern Ireland and address their needs. Had this bill been introduced before the summer recess, with some even primitive detail on the regulations, as should have been the case, I would have had no difficulty at all supporting Sinn Féin in their efforts. But as they know, as well as everyone else, with the bill coming forward at this late stage, we cannot easily allow their proposal to succeed. That is all the more upsetting, given that I and my party firmly believe that this bill, as currently set in front of us today, is a bad deal. In fact, I would go so far as to call it a rotten deal. I would challenge the Minister, respectfully, to himself acknowledge that he has thus far been unable to make any even remotely substantive changes to the bill. Mr. Speaker, now that I have made a few preliminary remarks on the delay, and before the Minister assumes that I or my party is calling for an outright breach of parity, I would like to assure him that we are not. It's a word that I have heard used more often in the last 18 months than I heard it in the first half-century of my life. According to the Oxford Dictionary, parity means the state or condition of being equal, especially as regards status or pay. The Ulster Unionist Party understands parity. We often accept it. But we believe that Northern Ireland should not be entirely bound by it. Where room for flexibility exists, we should at the very least explore, if not outrightly exploit it. On that point, as has been said, parity is much more often more than just financial. It's as much about operational matters. This bill is more than just about how much benefit a person is entitled to. Instead, it's a fundamental overhaul of the system. Not only are the amounts of money changing, but so too is almost every other aspect. The scrappage, if that's the right word, of so many benefits, changes to entitlement, and even simple administrative issues such as the frequency of payment. Whilst I don't dispute for one moment that there are currently far too many benefits with far too much complexity, I do have to express a little bit of scepticism on the motivation behind this reform. This is also an issue upon which the reasoned amendment touched. The coalition government in Westminster has gone to great lengths to dismiss the notion that the whole welfare reform agenda is centred on cost-cutting. When I look at individuals such as the current Work and Pensions Secretary, Ian Duncan-Smith, I see a man possessed, I believe, of compassion and a genuine belief in what he is doing. Nevertheless, I can't help but listen to other cabinet secretaries and leading party figures and fear that the current pressures on spending are being used as cover to attack a system that some people may feel ideologically opposed to. We must remember the measures contained within the bill and the changes to the social security system were announced as part of the coalition government's June 2010 budget and October 2010 spending review. Comments from recent days have done little to reduce this fear, and indeed I've heard it said directly in the media that the purpose behind the latest raft of proposals is solely cost-cutting. Don't get me wrong. I recognise the financial system the United Kingdom government is in. As a nation, we are spending more than we are collecting through tax receipts. Our national debt as of last month stands at a staggering £1.04 trillion, 66.1% of national income, and £41,500 for each and every household in the country. Think about that for a moment. £41,500 for every single front door in the country. Of course, there are some people who may say it is a bit rich for an Ulsterman to complain about spending more than what's being raised through taxes. But I can quite happily refer them to the days when the city of Belfast contributed 20% of the GDP of the United Kingdom, and tell them that I look forward to the day when we get ourselves through these current economic crises, which we will, that we in this part of the kingdom can once again become net contributors. Social security is a huge expenditure for the Treasury. Overall, the UK will spend well over £90 billion on welfare, excluding the state pension. In this financial year, £5.4 billion will be expended in Northern Ireland. It is said that the Westminster government wants to cut that spending by £18 billion by 2015. But that plan factored in economic recovery, which has not as yet appeared. The bill before us contains 54,000 words. It's estimated that it will slice 3.179 million of the welfare, 317.9 million of the welfare reform bill here in Northern Ireland over the next 3 years. That equates to £5,800 per word. And let us not forget that this money is above and separate from the block grant. Let us not forget that this money supports the poor, the needy, the sick and the disabled. The proposed legislation is essentially a matter of mathematics. And as we all know, mathematics is a very unforgiving science. To quote Charles Dickens and David Copperfield, misquote Charles Dickens and David Copperfield, Annual income, £20. Annual expenditure, £19.06. Result, happiness. Annual income, £20. Annual expenditure, £19.16. Sorry. Annual income, £20. Annual expenditure, £20.06. Result, misery. Mr. Speaker, I would like to take a few more moments to go through a number of issues within the bill, or as you may prefer to have them called today, the general principles of the bill. And I'd like to start with part one. Not only does the bill overhaul benefits, for it wipes many of them out completely and starts from scratch with the introduction of universal credit. The scrapping of so many central benefits, such as income support and child tax credits, could, in theory, make what has always been a complex field more straightforward. The Department of Work and Pensions tell us, and I feel we have no choice but to listen to them, as the Department of Social Development here is yet to demonstrate a shred of independent thought, that universal credit's overall objective is to address poverty by tackling worklessness and benefit dependency. I would agree with the Prime Minister, as probably everyone else in this Assembly would, when he says that people should always be better off in work. It is on this point that I'd also like to briefly make reference to the invisible half of welfare reform. You don't represent a constituency like East Belfast, much like anywhere else in Northern Ireland, I assume, and not frequently hear of the concerns of those people who go out to work day after day and manage, but only just to pay their bills, and do so without so much as a thank you from the government, never mind giving support. People are struggling out there. We can express real shock and real distress at occasional large job losses, and the executive departments can call all the economic summits they like, but all the while it makes little immediate impact on the ordinary man or the ordinary woman who is receiving no support from the government. There is effectively as much spent in Northern Ireland on social security as there is on our health service. I don't know many working people who would begrudge anyone their entitlements, but they do rightly need reassurance from us here and the Department that no one is taking the system for a ride. This welfare bill should be as much about equality for them as it is to ensure provision for those who will benefit from it. Nevertheless, getting back to the issue of universal credit, I suppose the benefit system of late has come to reflect the stereotype of government: complex, unwieldy, intolerant to learn from its own mistakes. At present, the welfare system has more than 30 benefits, each with their own rules and criteria. I actually think that the idea of a single benefit is preferable. Without wanting to go into too much depth, I have concern about a number of issues that surround universal credit. You wouldn't think by reading part one of this bill that it is effectively laying in stone a complete overhaul of our benefits system. Despite the fact that this bill runs to 133 clauses, 7 parts and 12 schedules, it is really, in many ways, purely enabling legislation. It broadly lays out the parameters of reform, and the real detail, the hardest hitting proposals, the deepest cutting thrusts, will actually come through the form of the regulations. The most concerning aspect for me of this whole debate is that this Assembly is being asked to walk blindly into the unknown. I recognise the overall regulations are still out to consultation, but we are being expected to approve the creation of a new benefit without even knowing the amount of money and the rates of money that will be paid under it. There has been a mountain of research conducted over recent months on universal credit. We are all aware of the frequently quoted findings from the Institute of Fiscal Studies, which stated that welfare reform will initially affect all parts of Northern Ireland society equally, but will increasingly go on to have a harder impact on those on lower incomes. I would like to go a little further on that point. Save the Children, for example, have stated that single parents working longer hours and low pay will be substantially worse off under universal credit. It's hardly the new wonderful benefit that some of us will have us believe. I heard the Minister state that the introduction of universal credit will lift 10,000 children out of poverty. But I would ask them, how many children will it push over the edge and into poverty? Another point we must remember is that the latest figures from Households Below Average Income measure, which shows 21% of children in Northern Ireland were living in relative poverty. The fact that there are 50,000 children living in what is termed as severe poverty is a shocking statistic, and one that we all should be truly ashamed of. I am aware that the previous programme for government contained a severe child poverty target, and the Executive agreed a definition. However, the current programme for government appears to have dropped such a target. Why? To me, it looked like an admission of defeat before even trying. Of course, it's no surprise that even when there are government targets as vague and unbinding as they are, just like there are government targets to reduce fuel poverty in Northern Ireland, this Executive appears blasé about missing them. It's important that we remember that more than half the children currently designated as being in poverty are in families where there is a parent in work. Because of the fact that the bill we have before us today is seemingly just a copy of the one debated in Parliament at the beginning of the year, I am disappointed that the Minister will have not been able to put forward a view and ask it to be taken into account that Northern Ireland is completely lacking in a fully operational childcare infrastructure here. And that is something which I respectfully suggest needs addressed. Yet, this major factor, I see Northern Ireland's lone parents in particular facing a disproportionate share of pain through changes to universal credit and additional conditionality and sanctions. Another issue, while still to be laid out in public, one of the many, is to be a major shift in the actual payments of benefits. For example, I have concerns about the frequency of benefits. The coalition government have often stated their idyllic vision of monthly payments, helping people to budget more appropriately and to adapt to working conditions more smoothly. There's one small difference in Northern Ireland, however. Even for those of us lucky enough to enjoy work, the majority still do not get paid monthly. Just taking a very simplistic example, if a household gets their monthly entitlement and within the first week they are forced by circumstance to spend a significant amount of it filling an oil tank, how does the department propose that that family will manage for the remainder of the month? Now, the cynical observer may say that this particular family should have demonstrated more sense than to spend too much on one particular utility. But I would make the point that if the same observer realised the trauma that this family will no doubt have previously went through about deciding whether they should enjoy the benefits of heat or of food, I am sure that they can understand why peace of mind on this particular issue may be preferred. I admit it's an unsophisticated case, but it is one which I am sure will be encountered far too often if monthly payments are forced upon the system here. This is the first issue which the Ulster Unionist Party will be seeking to see reversed, and one which we hope the Department will be able to demonstrate some of the much talked about flexibility. I have also concerns about the regulations flowing from this bill, which will dictate that payments go only to one single recipient in a household. Where a couple make a joint claim, they will have to decide who receives the single payment. Very few of us know exactly what goes on behind the closed doors of any homes, apart from our own. Given total control over what may be, in some cases, significant amount of money to a single individual, would to me raise concerns about the welfare and vulnerability of other persons in the same household, but also dependent on the same money. I would ask the Minister to detail what research has been done, either here or across the water, to determine how in households where there may be domestic violence and a fair, reasonable method of payment can be retained. I accept that this again may be a hypothetical issue, but it's one which the Department must surely be considering. Of course, then there is the issue about direct payments, and one which I believe has taken such prominence during the discussion on welfare reform, because to me anyway it makes absolutely no sense at all. Again, the government may look towards the ideal scenario of a family on universal credit, hurriedly searching for jobs, budgeting well with their monthly payments, and always making sure to keep enough aside to pay the rent. That is idealism, and unfortunately, it very seldom imitates reality. The Consumer Council have interesting research which shows that Northern Ireland comes bottom of the UK League of Financial Capability. A damning indictment. Indeed, they found that 1 in 5 people here feel it is not important to keep up to date with financial matters. Direct payments are genuinely an issue that baffles me. No one, and I mean no one, with any sense wants this apart from officials. I could maybe understand if tenants were crying out for this to be built into the bill and the regulations, but they're not. In fact, for those tenants who would like to avail of direct payments, the option is already there. Very few take it up. The Department of Work and Pensions, and maybe even the Department of Social Development, might think that empowering people with the responsibility to pay their rent to their landlords may be a positive step. But to me, forcing such a move is totally contradictory to what any responsible government should even be considering doing. Over the last months, I have heard countless welfare advocacy organisations pleading for direct payments to be avoided. They fear that personal debt will rocket, that for many rent arrears will spiral out of control, and homelessness may then unfortunately become an even greater problem. On top of this, we must also be aware of social and private landlords, the latter being a group of people who I'm not afraid to criticise when things go wrong. But in this case, they will be faced with significantly reduced financial security that comes from direct payments. For the housing associations, which this current executive is dependent upon to meet housing targets, they've been able, up to now, to secure borrowings at highly competitive rates, maximising their capital resources and subsequently delivering a good deal for the taxpayer. Any change to the current system could dramatically scale back the availability of necessary private finance. The Minister will no doubt be aware of the 5 demonstration projects which the Department of Work and Pensions have announced in order to prepare for these changes. These demonstration projects will run from June 2012 to June 2013. Can the Minister detail whether Northern Ireland will be running similar demonstration projects? And if not, why not? I will make one last point on direct payments and then move on. Tenants already do avail of direct payments, and in some cases up to 20% of tenants do, and that is welcome. Therefore, when the Minister inevitably stands up later and makes excuses about IT systems not being capable, or gives explanations about IT systems not being capable, he may even be able to use the same excuses of DWP about personal responsibility. Either way, I would urge him on this particular issue to show some compassion for the people that he is charged with looking after. There's a very simple answer to this. Rather than simply direct payments or none, why can't the Department offer a choice? And if people continue to insist on it, the Department could gently nudge people towards accepting and taking up responsibility if they believe they can handle it. Indeed, DWP have already announced such flexibility for lone parents. The benefits cap, I suppose, has been one of the more interesting aspects of the whole debate on welfare, with many people coming down on one side of the argument or other. To me, at first glance, the proposal to limit the level of entitlement to welfare benefits to £500 a week for a couple and £350 a week for a single household does make sense. I suppose if we are to be serious when we say work should always pay, then the only way to truly ensure this is by the introduction of a cap. Interestingly, the benefit cap is an issue which strict parity will benefit Northern Ireland as the cap will effectively be set to correspond with the level of earnings in Great Britain. Just for clarification, could the Minister detail exactly how many households will be affected in Northern Ireland? I have sought this information previously for him, but have not as yet received a definitive answer. I don't need to reiterate all these points that I and other members have made on the changes to housing benefit, many of which have already been enforced in Northern Ireland. We all know the issues: an increasing housing benefit budget being slashed by unsympathetic means. Given our lack of appropriate housing, I have previously sought guarantees from the Minister on safeguards for changes arising from the changes to the shared room rate. I would again ask him today, can he tell me what he has done? Can he tell me that Northern Ireland's housing stock will be able to adapt to these changes to housing benefit, both now and in what is yet to come? On the wider issue, many of the requirements laid out in the bill, this legislation, if made law, it will place significant requirements of which it expects the claimants to meet in order to receive benefits. Not wanting to stray from this debate too widely, but I could remind the Minister that the number of people claiming unemployment-related benefits stood at 63,100 in August. And this, sadly, is only heading in one direction if recent events are anything to go by. I am sure that even the Minister looked on appreciatively up until recently, when he noted Northern Ireland's employment level below the UK average. Well, I'm sorry, but with 8.2%, we are now on the wrong side of average, and we are significantly off message in regards to our economic inactivity rate of 26.9%, the highest among the 12 UK regions. We must also remember that young people growing up in workless households are much more likely to struggle to find stable employment themselves. The point I am making, Mr. Speaker, is that whilst I skim through Part 2 of the bill, I see all the new glossy clauses on conditionality and sanction. I have seen and heard little over recent months as to how the Department expects people to move from benefits to jobs when there are already so few jobs available. I am in no doubt that welfare reform must work in tandem with a revitalised economy, improving our education system and increasing our early intervention. There is a clear link between long-term unemployment, cycles of deprivation and health, and Northern Ireland must begin to tackle the plight of those people becoming trapped in a web of dependency. But today's proposals do nothing to answer these questions. Moving on, whilst it's not fair just to blame the Department of Social Development, after all, they appear to have taken their usual unwavering direction from DWP. I do find it sadly characteristic that even amongst the biggest shake-up of welfare in generations, they have found the time to devote enough energy to review their counter-fraud and error capability. Officials and the Minister are keen to detail that under this bill, claimants who either fail to report or are negligent with their claims will face strict financial penalties. I would like to draw the Minister's attention that although his department administers around $5 billion each year in benefits, they only incurred losses of $54 million in 2011 to error and fraud. Any right-thinking people will say that $54 million is still too much, and I agree, but it must be taken in context. It accounted for 1.1% of total expenditure and compares very favourably with estimates of over 2% for the Department of Work and Pensions. Of course, like any good department in Northern Ireland, DSD distance themselves for blame from supposed failings. But I'd like to make the point that of the 1% loss, 0.4% is fraud, 0.3% is customer error, and the other 0.3% remains official and departmental error. Another major element of today's bill is the introduction of the Personal Independence Plan, which will, beginning from June 2013, replace Disability Living Allowance. Of course, it's emblematic of the way in which this process has been conducted, that even now we have very little idea of what the detailed design of PIP will look like. Whilst I would hope there would be a simplification of the process, I would hope even more that the Department is aware of what they are letting themselves in for by taking this on at the same time as the introduction of universal credit. The Department claims, quite rightly in my opinion, DLA is in dire need of review. It hasn't been looked at since its introduction 20 years ago. Again, it is a benefit about which there is quite a degree of genuine public concern. The Department is administering £750 million of Treasury money on this benefit alone every year, a sum bigger than many of our executive budgets put together. The need for the Disability Living Allowance and Personal Independence Plan, when they're introduced, is comprehensive. But we need to ensure that it is targeted towards those who need it and those who deserve it. With over 10% of our population, 180,000 people currently in receipt of it, I hope the Department are fully prepared for the body of work which they and their staff on the ground are about to embark on. I wait patiently for the regulation coming forward that details the final rules on what constitute daily activities and mobility activities when assessing entitlement to PIP. I cannot emphasise enough to the Minister the sheer importance of getting this particular aspect of welfare reform right. People, whether they be on the mobility component or the daily living component, will be subsequently judged, and for many other schemes using this determination. For example, I would raise the particular issue of members of victims groups in Northern Ireland and their eligibility for funding through channels such as the Northern Ireland Memorial Fund. I would ask the Minister, I would plead with the Minister to give a commitment that such individuals will not be disadvantaged through these reforms. Of course, it would be remiss of me not to use this opportunity to raise my concerns about the overall assessment process of this new payment. I would urge the Minister to look at the work capability assessment and everything that has gone wrong there, and learn, sir, please, from those mistakes. There's a justifiable concern that a private company involved in that travesty will now be in a prime position to secure the bid for assessing personal independence plan applicants. If that happens, then all I will say that the Minister needs to think long and hard about the related measures and performance-related measures which he builds into that particular contract. No. Mr. Mosky didn't. I don't think I will either. Just finally on PIP, if I could make one request from the Minister, and that is to be understanding of Northern Ireland's individual need. Given the fact that this small province that we all jointly call home is but a small dot on the map globally and has emerged out of 40 years of murder and mayhem, something which continues to contribute to the fact that the current main disabling condition for disability living allowance recipients here is mental health. That's over 40,000 people, many of which already believe this world can be a scary enough place, and now to run the gauntlet of being forced through the new assessments. If people on disability living allowance are not successful in their applications for PIP, it will have a far greater impact than just the immediate financial loss, for it will affect their entitlements to other forms of support. And if they turn and decide to appeal, they'll face even further costs in the tribunals. Some, I have no doubt, can and should be able to be removed off this benefit, but those about which I am most concerned are the silent majority who will remain too afraid to speak up, have no one to speak for them, and claim what they're entitled to. I would urge the Minister to ensure that there does remain an appropriate level of support and information for people during this entire process. Given that there will be huge numbers of people involved in the adoption of universal credit, not to mention the transfer to PIP, it is vital that appropriate provisions are put in place to ensure that the process runs as smoothly as possible. We all know, as elected representatives in our own constituencies, the value of independent advice services, and without them, I doubt that anyone in this House believes the current social security system will be able to cope. currently, never mind after the reforms are brought in. I know through my time in Castlereagh and East Belfast, I've worked closely with organisations such as Advice NI. I cannot stress enough the role which these organisations will play, and therefore I would make a specific request of the Minister and ask him, would he support the inclusion of a new clause in the bill which gives people a statutory right to independent advice and support? Another huge issue facing all of us here today, especially if the amendment is successful, is the future of the Social Fund in Northern Ireland. Unless today's legislation proceeds through all the necessary channels correctly, there is a risk, and I don't think it's a bluff and I don't think it's a threat, there is a risk that all the crucial support that this offers may disappear. It is highly regrettable that we now find ourselves in the situation of needing to make haste or rush. We must bear in mind the hundreds of thousands of people who benefit from this fund each year. Surely, Minister, there are safeguards which you could put in place so that this situation cannot come to fruition if we did find ourselves out of sync with the current timetable. Given that welfare reform has now come to the fore, it is important that the Executive as a collective body come to agreement on the future of passported benefits in Northern Ireland. The problem, from what I can see, is the same as it is with every other issue, that every department administers their own individual benefits, and until they can put that silo mentality to the side, the argument is over, even before it has begun. It will be necessary for departments here to develop new solutions, to enable them to have new criteria in place for the introduction of universal credit. I am glad that there does appear to have been at least some planning for this, given that departments across the water are in discussions with officials here. Of course, much like everything else in this bill, these efforts look to me a little too little and a little too late. Unsurprisingly, then, that I am told that the Department of Work and Pensions are currently, and allegedly desperately, trying to pull together an interim IT system to buy but a little time. The Minister may not have wanted it raised here today, but I am sure that he is yet to receive one willing participant. But the issue of introducing income thresholds for eligibility for these passported benefits is one that must be confronted and addressed. I am led to believe that the Executive Subgroup on Welfare Reform, in which my colleague Danny Kennedy has been faithfully attending for months on end, was recently debating this issue. Just on that point, and given the situation we see here today, the bill being introduced so late it's right on the wire and the subsequent to some grandstanding Sinn Féin amendment, what does the Minister of Social Development actually believe that this subgroup achieved? One thing's for sure, it certainly wasn't political consensus. I'd appreciate if the Minister could provide an update on his intentions for this group, now that the bill has finally been introduced. Mr. Speaker, I have raised a number of specific issues within the bill and the regulations that may flow from it. There is no doubt that this proposed legislation places upon us a heavy responsibility, as these changes will impact upon a great many of our citizens. It is therefore of the utmost importance that each of us is aware and takes into account the things that may and will flow from our actions here today. At that point, I would like to raise the level of public awareness about what is coming down the line. Yes, if you ask many people in the street if they knew of imminent welfare reform, I'm sure many of them would. However, if you went on to ask them to explain it, they'd be stumped. It's not their fault. Rather, it's a failure of the department to adequately inform the public of what is coming. We all know of the digital television switchover. We've known about it for years. But for the last number of months, we can't go anywhere, even the Great Hall, without being confronted by digital, hearing messages coming down the date. They're everywhere. They're on the radio, they're on billboards, and they're even on the televisions themselves. But yet the most radical shake-up to social welfare in the last 50 or 60 years. And there are huge gaps in the public awareness Of course, the rationale behind the TV switchover campaign was to avoid a surge of people turning on their television to blank screens. But surely people getting letters saying that their benefit is gone or has been scrapped will have an even more daunting effect. Therefore, all I'll say is that the Department needs to consider getting its act together on this and start communicating the message clearly to the public that there are big changes coming and that the support that people may be receiving now could be very much reduced and significantly difficult in years to come. It may surprise people outside this chamber who are listening to this debate that we are speaking in such a methodical tone. But that, unfortunately, is the manner of this bill. It was clearly drafted with little compassion or understanding. And it was all the more disappointing that Northern Ireland had an opportunity to make our points, but that we have so far been unsuccessful. I fear the ship may have already sailed on many of these issues. And given the failure of Northern Ireland to adequately get safeguards built into the bill both here and in London, we all face an uphill battle. The burden which is about to descend us here and in the DSD committee is unique, as we alone of the 3 devolved assemblies and parliaments that serve the United Kingdom accepted the devolution of these responsibilities. We will consider and discuss and eventually arrive at the dreaded moment when politics becomes real, and we are required to make judgments and take a decision in the sure and certain knowledge that we will bring misery to so many of our people. And I wonder, as I approach, you'll be glad to hear the end, I wonder, to misquote Winston Churchill, what is the good of all of this? The only guide to a man, or indeed a political party, is their actions. The only shield to their memory is their conscience and the rectitude of their actions. Without this shield, it is very unwise to go down any path, as we are so often let down by the failure of our calculations and the unforeseen outcomes of our actions. With this shield, however, we will walk always in the legions of the righteous. This bill, in its current form, will in effect remove money from Northern Ireland economy which is not currently included in the block grant. The overwhelming majority who benefit within the current legislation from these payments do not have any real disposable income after the essentials of shelter, food, heat, light, power and clothing have been apportioned. The Minister has made reference to moving to work. He is negating the fact that Northern Ireland has a low-wage economy, and unfortunately too many people find themselves in the position of needing to almost subsidise their wages from benefits. Therefore, whilst this bill and the subsequent regulations may have a cost saving, unfortunately I do fear, and I genuinely fear, that they will inevitably force already struggling families to rein in their spending that little bit extra, so that local businesses will then feel an immediate knock-on effect. I hope today's debate will have been some benefit to the Minister. I even hope that some of what I have said will be of some benefit to the Minister. Even if it was the case that the members of the committee were reiterating what many of us have held long-term concerns, unfortunately the Minister has yet to indicate that he has listened. The truth behind all the numbers, behind all the rhetoric, the truth is that this legislation will impact upon people. It will impact upon people regardless of their age, race, religion, colour, creed or gender. Many of them, to our shame, among the most vulnerable and helpless. I think of a former UDR soldier currently awaiting an ESA appeal who suffers from post-traumatic stress disorder, having witnessed his comrade being blown in half in front of him. A few years later, he came home to find his partner in the act of taking her own life. He held her limp body, calling for help, but no help came. He broke down at the last appeal hearing, and on the advice of the doctor, it had to be abandoned. I think of the young woman with whom I attended court this morning and a last-ditch attempt to prevent her from acquiring a criminal record. Expelled from school in her early teens, currently at Tech learning basic literacy and numeracy skills. A daily medication list that would baffle most pharmacists. Attempting to treat conditions ADD, ADHD, bipolar, schizophrenia, threatened schizophrenia, self-harm, mild spectrum autism and personality disorder. That's a lot to carry in a 20-year-old head. I think of a young woman who recently met with myself and my party leader. Her legs were scarred with razor cuts like railroad tracks from her knees to her waist, where she had desperately tried to eradicate the memory of years of sexual abuse at the hands of her brother. Her ESA appeal, and it should never have got to the appeal stage, had to be abandoned, and the process was tantamount to cruelty and torture. And I know, because I was there. These are among the people who will find the amounts of money which allow them to subsist at the lowest levels of society, cut to the point where subsistence is impossible. There are difficult decisions coming down the line, and the committee, under the guidance of Mr Maskey, faces many long days' work. Admittedly, due to the short time scale, we will not be able to dedicate, in my view, the appropriate time that they each deserve. This bill will affect every constituency, every demographic within it. There is therefore no political party that should ever believe that it should be awarded anything but the maximum scrutiny. When we consider this legislation, as we must, word by word, line by line, paragraph by paragraph and clause by clause, we must ask ourselves several questions. What happens if we support this? What happens if we don't? Who will benefit and enjoy advantage? Who will not benefit and endure disadvantage? What will it cost? And finally, and perhaps for me most importantly, can another way be found? Of course, I should also say at this stage that whilst we are having this debate with plenty of words but little in the way of detail, they will be followed up by the regulations, which we have yet to see. But that, I fear, will be the most painful part, and the part where there is least room for amendments. This is all the more frustrating, given the fear that many of the regulations may, by necessity, or designed through the confirmatory resolution. How is this Assembly meant to demonstrate total scrutiny of these proposals if we only have a chance to vote for them 6 months after they are introduced? I would ask to use this debate to ask the Minister to detail by what procedures he envisages each of these regulations coming through. Be a cheer now. Drawing my remarks to a close, I would like to reiterate the Ulster Unionist Party belief that there are too many benefits, with too many differing criteria. To do nothing is not an option, and inaction will only go on to make things worse in future years as well for expenditure starts to cripple our public spending. When something is starting to fail, you fix it. However unpalatable these proposals may be, we are faced with the reality of a coalition government seemingly unprepared to listen, and the Social Development Department has yet to make its voice heard. Nothing that I have said here today should be taken as support for this bill. However, the reasoned amendment takes us all into uncharted and dangerous waters. On balance, we will allow the passage of this bill to its second reading to the committee, to allow the committee to do its work. I must warn the two main parties that this is not a blank cheque, and we reserve the right during the future to follow our conscience and, if necessary, withdraw support from this flawed, compassionless, soulless, mathematical calculation that does not put people first. It is now the responsibility of everyone in this House to ensure that what we do now, we do right. And I will leave you with one final quote from a film called Forrest Gump. That's all I've got to say about that.
Yeah. Mark Durkin. Mr. Durkin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I find that when Mr. Copeland starts to speak, you never know what you're going to find as well. I rise today in opposition to this bill and in support of the reasoned amendment. It will be hard to follow what's quite possibly the best and certainly the longest speech I've ever heard in opposition to a piece of legislation. However, we do wish to go further in the event of the amendment falling. We in the SDLP do accept, indeed we welcome the need for a simple, more accessible benefit system, but we will not accept this bill, which as it stands is a shameful attack on the vulnerable in our society. We will not swallow the Tories' peddling of cuts dressed as reform, nor will we accept the demonisation of those on benefits. This Assembly must do what we were elected to do. We must represent the people of Northern Ireland, and we must, in this case, defend them. In its current form, the Welfare Reform Bill does not recognise any specific circumstances of Northern Ireland. We are not oblivious to the implications of breaking and the constraints of parity. We hear loudly the threatening noises from Westminster and their echoes in this chamber and over the airwaves, but we cannot and we will not accept any legislation that will force thousands of our citizens into poverty. We have previously outlined that we would not accept this bill without some concessions and flexibilities, some of which are rightly identified in the amendment and to which I will speak in more detail later. We have been patient and waiting for the Minister to secure these concessions. I do not dispute the effort of himself or his officials, but we must examine its results to date. Despite ongoing meetings and negotiations with DWP and Lord Freud, we have not been presented with anything that takes specific account of our circumstances. Is DWP leading DSD a merry dance? We need to see real evidence of their commitment if we are to let this bill pass even to its next stage. We are not prepared to just rubber stamp a piece of Tory legislation. The Minister will argue today that we have no choice. We simply cannot afford to sustain our own welfare system. I agree and I understand. However, the ball is in the Minister's court, where it has been for some time. We have received continuous assurances that work is ongoing, that progress is being made in securing a better system for the North. The specific circumstances of this region have been acknowledged time and time again, yet here we are today with what is basically a blueprint of a Tory bill. It isn't working in England, and it will most certainly not work here. This legislation is an insult to the people of the North, and it is insulting to this institution as a law-making body. We are meant to be a devolved government. We are bound to legislate in a manner that serves our people best. Allowing the bill to pass as it is certainly does not do that. That is why we support the reasoned amendment, and why, should it fall, we are prepared to explore triggering a petition of concern to prevent the passage of this attack on our people. While the amendment is not exhaustive, it does certainly encompass the real concerns we all share, I'm sure, relating to the bill. Yesterday, our party, through our Executive Minister Alex Attwood, explored the utilisation of Standing Order 35. This would instigate the creation of an ad hoc committee to deal with equality and human rights issues in new legislation. We recognise the consequences of dumping parity, but it would be weakness to allow our people to be dumped on by parity. Our idea around this committee is about stretching parity, not breaking it, so that welfare law and administration is formed and informed by the rights and equality protections promised to all our people, duties with which this Assembly is corporately charged. There are specific issues relating to women and children which would be covered under Section 75, and this committee would thrash those out fully. We must use our constitutional tools to make a better job of what is clearly a bad crossover bill. If we do not, we are guilty of a dereliction of dramatic capacity and indifference to this bill's serious implications for vulnerable people here. Furthermore, Standing Order 35 makes the issue about assembly responsibility. We have heard already of the Minister's discussions with Freud. Alex Maskey, the Chair of Social Development Committee, has spoken of a meeting with Lord Freud in the near future. My own party, the SDLP, have also made representations and had meetings in this manner. And we were, at one of these meetings, given assurances around direct payments and the possibility of retaining fortnightly payments. But this privatisation of parties going separately suits DWP. We need to work together as an assembly on this. This committee is a tool for us to do so in an open and transparent manner. It will flag up the gross inequalities within the bill and prove to Westminster our need for concessions. The standing order can, it transpires, only be invoked by a minister acting with executive approval or by the relevant committee chair, and I would appeal and will be appealing in both directions that this is given serious consideration. It would give an outworking to the very pertinent points made in the reasoned amendment. It would not have a massive impact time-wise, and it can only strengthen the Minister's hand in his ongoing negotiations. The SDLP has been consistent and vociferous in our concerns about and in our opposition to welfare cuts. We have a strong track record on welfare reform at Westminster, at the Executive and here in this Assembly. Indeed, several months ago, I brought forward a motion calling for the mitigation of the negative impacts of this bill on vulnerable people here to be escalated to the highest political priority of the Executive. We have in the past seen the prioritisation of other issues, the devolution of policing and justice, Presbyterian Mutual Society, and more recently, corporation tax. However, our calls were rejected by the House. Now it looks like this issue has become a very high political priority, and we firmly believe that any threat or prospect of impasse could have been ameliorated by earlier decisive action. Another strand of our proposal incorporated the formation of an ad hoc committee to work on the bill, and today we have renewed that call with reference to Standing Order 35. Again, this pre-legislative scrutiny may well have staved off the need for brinkmanship now. Sorry, no other members have given way today, so I'm not going to either. But thank you. I'll be here for quite some time. If I need a break, I'll come back to you.
You have to take your time.
With regard to the bill itself, we have always agreed that our welfare system needed reformed. We cannot, however, stand by and see it completely dismantled. The rationale given by the Tories and regurgitated here in the past and again today, that this bill is about making work pay and helping people into work, is admirable. It is also, however, false. The real motivation here is clear. It is about cutting costs, and those in welfare are evidently a much easier target than big business and tax dodgers. Further evidence of this came from the Conservative conference yesterday. Further cuts to the tune of £10 billion and policies on child benefit that wouldn't be out of place in some dystopian fantasy. It is easy to come up with these policies from the comfort of an ivory tower in Whitehall. The approval and implementation of them here, for us and by us, is a completely different proposition. I don't doubt for a second that every MLA in here has serious concerns about the impact of this legislation in their own constituencies, on their own constituents, on their own friends, on their own families. We must, as I have said, work together to make this bill, which none of us can deny is an odious piece of legislation, less damaging. However, as it stands now, we cannot accept it, and the SDLP cannot and will not vote to let it pass. While what we do know about this bill is terrifying and what it will enable is even worse, the real devil is in its lack of detail. Passing this bill in its current form without regulations is inviting even further cuts and hardship. We have seen the appetite of the current coalition government for attacking the vulnerable. Who's to say what a single Tory government might do in the future? This bill enables them not so much to move the goalposts, but to make them portable so they can be moved over and over again. Let us, however, look at what we do know. That this bill will have a major impact on people's incomes, people's housing, people's mental and physical health, people's independence, men, women and children's lives, and will have major repercussions across society as a whole, not just on benefit claimants. Millions and millions of pounds will be lost from our local economy, inevitably resulting in further job losses and shop closures. Should the bill progress to its next stage, we will work tirelessly as a party, and I as an individual with my colleagues on DSD committee, to identify, craft and table positive, realistic, achievable amendments to the bill. The areas that need improved are manifold, and my party colleagues will elaborate on them later, but I will now just give an overview of what we see as the major problems therein. The proposal that there will be a single household payment to one nominated person is one that has caused great consternation, particularly among those in the women's and children's sectors who, correctly in my opinion, view this as a highly retrograde step that will inevitably lead to an increase in financial abuse and, more than likely, an increase in physical abuse and family breakdown. We should enable split payments under equality grounds. Universal credit is to be a digital self-service. I'm not going to talk about the digital switchover, don't worry. People will be expected to make their claims online. I want to know exactly how it is intended that this be managed, given people's lack of access to computers and their lack of confidence in computer literacy. The committee were shown or presented research from Ipsos Mori on this, and despite what I felt was clever manipulation of statistics to disguise it, the research indicated that this could and will be a real nightmare. Government says it will assist people, but I have concerns over the time frame and the amount of money it will take to get people, particularly older people, digitally ready. Also, what are the implications for our many rural dwellers here where broadband connectivity is patchy, to say the least? The move towards universal credit, we are told, is also about teaching responsibility. The household payment will be monthly, and claimants who have little or no experience of budgeting will be expected to learn the hard way. We fear that this monthly payment is fraught with danger. It maximises the risk of families running out of money weeks before their next payment and having to rely on charities, or much worse, on loan sharks to survive. I believe that an increase in real poverty and debt is inevitable. This policy has been defended as mirroring the experience of working households, all of whom, we are told, are paid monthly. This displays from Westminster a complete lack of knowledge, a lack of research, and indeed a lack of interest because we know that here the vast majority of households or people on low income are still paid on a weekly basis. Ian Duncan-Smith has recently spoken about ensuring the IT system's capacity to retain fortnightly payments for vulnerable people and families. But who defines vulnerable? If the IT system can differentiate for a few, surely it can differentiate for many. Universal credit will streamline existing benefits. We have seen this streamlining commence with the migration of claimants from incapacity benefit to employment support allowance prior to its subsumption into universal credit. This process has been traumatic for thousands of claimants, particularly here in the north, where we have higher levels of incapacity, particularly through mental health conditions, which has been attributed to the legacy of the Troubles. These circumstances were not recognised when this regulation was introduced, and the impact of this has been disastrous. We have a fitness for work assessment that is not fit for purpose itself. People's lives have been wrecked, people's conditions seriously worsened, and the department has been unable to handle the huge number of appeals, many successful, following erroneous assessments. We must ensure that lessons are learned. We must address this mess, and of course we must be certain that the new personal independence payment test for DLA claimants is fair and robust. Universal credit is not just for those out of work or unable to work. There are around 200,000 people here on tax credits. Many of these do have very specific circumstances. Streamlining the system treats people as numbers and with little or no regard for circumstances, and we need further clarification of what circumstances might or would or could be considered, especially in relation to caring responsibilities and for those caring for severely disabled persons. The introduction of and increase in sanctions on those people on universal credit deemed fit to work is very worrying. Where are the people who dreamt this up from? Go ahead.
His answer as to who dreamt this up. Well, we know where it was dreamt. Like all legislation that came from across the water, but implemented in Northern Ireland. The minister who introduced the primary legislation in respect of this was his own party colleague, Alex Atwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you for the intervention. I had asked where it was dreamt up, as the member says, we do know where it was dreamt up, and it certainly wasn't dreamt up here, either by my party colleague or by your party, by my party colleague or
the member of the floor.
Party colleague, the current minister. That's not where it was dreamt up. It wasn't dreamt up here, but we're having to live with it. Sorry, was that another intervention? With the unemployment rate here in the north so high and so little in the way of job creation and opportunities, this is not so much helping people into work as taking money off people for not being able to find work, or, given the flaws in the work capability assessment, people who are physically incapable of work. We need to focus more on job creation. Not only are we incapable of creating jobs for our people, but imposing these draconian measures will also force more and more of our young people to leave their families and take their chances in Australia or wherever. There are also issues around the imposition of sanctions on an individual when there is the one single household benefit, and the impact that this sanction will have on children within that household. The single household payment, or rather nominated person provision, is also likely to cause confusion when one partner reaches pensionable age. Will, for example, a couple's eligibility for exemption be determined by the age of the older or younger partner? The implications of this bill on housing here cannot be understated. We have already debated some aspects of this within this chamber, most recently when we brought forward a motion 2 weeks ago calling for the retention of direct payment of housing benefit to landlords. Under universal credit, it is proposed that these direct payments are abolished, and this can only lead to debt, hardship and homelessness. Housing benefit requirements here are very different than elsewhere in the UK. Given the fact that the majority of claimants in Northern Ireland have never had to budget rent on any basis, it will be much more difficult for individuals and families to adjust to the universal credit system as a whole. It is also accepted that people here are less financially capable than our counterparts in the other regions. People here will require much more support and training in order to learn the skills needed to manage their financial affairs. There is a reliance in Northern Ireland on post office accounts that is not prevalent in other jurisdictions. This will increase the difficulty for tenants to make payments to landlords in time, as the accounts do not allow for outward payments. Under occupancy is another aspect of the bill that is hugely punitive and draconian. Tenants will see their housing benefit drastically reduced and will have to make that up from other components of their universal credit, which is already based on subsistence levels. Given the segregated nature of our housing stock and our very limited number of smaller housing units, this policy will be unworkable here. The bill deals with the development of personalised support through personal independence payment. We are in favour of the aim, supporting disabled people to exercise choice and control and lead independent lives. But we have genuine concerns shared by people with disabilities, their carers and their advocates. While we appreciate the need for reform in terms of creating a simple and efficient system, we worry that in practice the changes to DLA will do just the opposite. We have a duty to protect and support the most vulnerable, and we will only accept a reform of DLA that is able to support disabled people and their families and enable them to deal with the additional costs associated with their needs. We have major concerns that under PIP, differences will be based on age rather than on severity of disability. Another huge worry is the suspension of PIP within 2 weeks of a claimant's hospitalisation. The prevalence of mental illness here in the North is in itself grounds for us to be considered a special case. And the failures of the work capability assessment, as I've referred to earlier, do not give us confidence that the PIP's assessment will be thorough and take these considerations into proper account. The extension of the qualifying period to 6 months will hinder those in need of urgent help or with short-term but serious conditions. We do welcome the inclusion of special rules for those who are terminally ill, but we are worried that the removal of the automatic benefit entitlement for certain groups will have a devastating impact. Existing categories, such as those with blindness, deafness and severe mental impairment, must be protected and retained. The impact of this bill will be particularly harsh on women. This will be elaborated on by my colleague Dolores Kelly later. One aspect I will touch on, though, is the benefit cap. Now, last week the committee received a briefing, a high-level briefing in fact, on universal credit. I explicitly asked if child benefit would be included in the benefit cap and was eventually told by departmental officials that it wouldn't be. I welcomed this and was going to laud it today as a beneficial breach of parity, as well as a very surprising one, given the DUP's opposition to the exclusion of child benefit at Westminster. However, I did discover at lunchtime that it is in fact included. This means that we were actually misled by departmental officials in committee, although I don't for 1 second assume that that was deliberate. But it is most unsatisfactory that we are today being asked to pass a bill devoid of detail and with huge question marks over the detail that actually is in it. More disturbing is the fact that the inclusion of child benefit in the cap flies in the face of programme for government pledges to reduce child poverty, an area which is obviously close to Mr Bell's heart as he intervened on it earlier. Squeezing the cap, using regulations along with child benefit will play a big part in the Tories' further £10 billion of cuts that they seek. What clause of the current bill prevents such a move being extended here? Most of the detail which affects the key aims behind the government's intentions for welfare reform, for example, simplicity and improving work incentives, is left to the regulations. We are concerned that the regulations will not be subject to effective scrutiny. We need the Minister to be clear on this issue. Indeed, a future Assembly and a future Minister from whatever party should be able to see some effort made to protect them and, more importantly, to protect families from such obvious prospects. In conclusion, yes.
Before you conclude your remarks, and I wanted to leave you finish your remarks before I ask you to give way, I wonder would the member agree with me that there was a very curious point made by Mr Hamilton when he mentioned my name as a former DSD minister in dispatches. And there's a curious point, and would you agree with me that it's a curious point, that the point he made was as follows, that it was an SDLP minister that legislated for welfare reform. Does he agree with me that that demonstrates that the SDLP certainly accept that there's an obligation upon this House to legislate for welfare and welfare reform? The point, however, is this, that when this House legislated for welfare reform, Mr Speaker, when this House legislated for welfare reform, I made sure that the sanctions regime that Mr Hamilton referred to was neutered. And how was that neutered? Because we were able to put into the body of law different regime here when it came to parents given the different childcare arrangements. We put it into the body of law, Mr Speaker, that childcare circumstances in the North, different from what they were in Britain, meant that the law would be different than the law in Britain. Yet Mr Hamilton would pretend to this House today that he has to legislate today on the basis of the second draft that doesn't reflect the different childcare arrangements in the North. And more than that, Mr Speaker, would the member agree with me? Would the member...
Order. I've certainly listened to the member and I've given him quite a bit of latitude, as the member will know, continually in this House. And I've continually said to all sides of this House that interventions should be short. They certainly should not be statements. And I think this afternoon we have got a statement. Mr Durkin, please carry on.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his intervention, and I think I do agree. It's that, although it's not, some of the points raised by previous speakers were even more curious, believe me. For the reasons outlined,
Please, order.
The SDLP will be opposing the passage of this bill. We have talked a lot and heard a lot about operational flexibilities, but in the continued absence of any, we cannot support the bill. Let me be clear, we are not opposed to welfare reform, but we are opposed to unfair reform. We support the reasoned amendment and believe our own proposal to use Standing Order 35 and establish this new dedicated committee could help work through the points raised in the amendment and, indeed, the other party's problems with the amendment. We do believe that there is time to work this out, but passing the bill today with no resolutions will reduce that time. It is for that reason that should the amendment fall, should our calls go unheeded, we are prepared to activate a petition of concern. This is not...
You know, you were earlier praising the IT skills of the House. And, from the IT in front of me, you're talking about this sham fight of a petition of concern. While Patsy McGlone, who's sitting in front of you, is tweeting out Sinn Féin will not support your petition of concern. And you're too small a party for it to have any effectiveness whatsoever. So can we get on with the real business, which is dealing with this in committee, dealing with the real issues that matter to people, which is about the social fund, it's about keeping jobs, particularly the hundreds of jobs in the northwest. That's your constituents who are going to lose their jobs if we don't put this through, which we have no option. So let's not have anything more of the sham fight. Your member knows that it's nothing other than a sham fight, and you're mistaking the real business of the House.
Order. If we're going to have interventions, let us have short interventions. Allow the member to carry on. Order.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And it's great to hear a member of the executive talking about jobs in the northwest. I'd love to hear them talk about creating them. Never mind protecting them.
Order.
It has been reported.
If the member could take a seat, let's have remarks through the chair, all through the chair. Also, as well, there are some members across the floor addressing members as you. They should not be doing that either. Allow the member to continue.
Okay. If the member had let me finish, it has been reported to me that Sinn Féin have chosen not to support our petition, which is a matter of great regret, but not great surprise to me. It will beg the question if their opposition to welfare reform is real or is it rhetorical. But let me be clear, this is not about playing politics. This is about protecting people. That is why the SDLP was formed, and that is what the SDLP is all about. Yeah.